I've told this story exactly twice in my life. Once to a military tribunal that didn't believe me. Once to my daughter, late on a Wednesday night, when she asked why I still sleep with the lights on. She believed me, the tribunal didn't. I don't know which one I'm more grateful for. What I'm about to tell you happened 7 years ago, on a station most people have never heard of, during an event the Galactic Assembly officially classified as atmospheric interference, and then sealed behind 14 layers of bureaucratic paperwork. I've read those papers. I helped write some of them. And I'm here to tell you that every single word in the official report is a careful, deliberate lie designed to make what happened that day sound like nothing. It was not nothing. It was the day the most dangerous thing in the known universe came to Earth, and then the most dangerous thing in the known universe disappeared. And we were the reason. Let me start with what Earth Station Mirador actually is, because if you've never served up there, you probably picture something clean, something gleaming, science fiction corridors with blue lighting and officers who look like they just stepped off a recruitment poster. Mirador is none of those things. It sits in high orbit, about 23,000 kilometers up, and from the outside it looks like someone welded together 6 different space stations that were never meant to touch. Because that's exactly what happened. The original structure went up in 2041, back when Earth was first getting serious about orbital defense. Then came the expansion in 2047, then the refugee intake platform in 2051, when the Dren conflict displaced about 500,000 civilians from the outer colonies. Then the military wing. Then the medical annex. Then the communications tower that everyone jokes looks like a thumb sticking up from a fish. By the time I was posted there, Mirador housed around 8,000 people from 40 different species. It was loud. It smelled like recycled air and too many different kinds of food being cooked at once. The corridors were always slightly too warm or slightly too cold, depending on which species had won the latest argument with the climate control team. The lights flickered in Section D because they'd been flickering since 2053, and nobody had found the right replacement component. I loved it, honestly. It felt real in a way that perfect places never do. My job was security, not the glamorous kind, not the standing outside embassies in a nice uniform kind. I was a patrol sergeant, which meant I walked the same corridors every shift, dealt with disputes over cargo claims and docking rights, and the occasional fight that broke out in the common areas when somebody said something offensive in one species' language that sounded complimentary in 3 others. I worked with a team of 12. Good people. Mixed species human, 2 Vakari, a Sauron named Tashel who was 7 feet tall and gentle as anyone I've ever met, and others. We functioned the way long-posted teams always do, with a kind of shorthand that outsiders can't read, a rhythm built over years of doing the same work in the same place. We thought we'd seen everything Mirador had to offer. We hadn't. The first sign was the silence in the docking bay. I want to be precise about that because people who weren't there sometimes imagine it as a dramatic silence, everyone stopping what they're doing, turning to look, a hush falling over a crowd like in a film. It wasn't like that. It was the absence of the small sounds, the mechanical sounds. The sounds that run so constantly in a working docking bay that you stop hearing them after your first week. The cycle of the atmospheric equalizers, the low hum of the magnetic docking clamps, the chatter of cargo handlers across the comm system. Those sounds stopped. I noticed it before I understood why. I was in the middle of filing a docking violation report. A Sauron freighter had come in 7 degrees off axis and clipped a guidance beacon, and I remember I stopped typing mid-sentence because something felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just off, like the station had taken a breath and held it. I looked up from my terminal. Tashel was standing about 15 meters away, near the secondary airlock, and she had gone completely still. Tashel never went completely still. She was one of those people who was always in small motion, shifting weight, adjusting the tools on her belt, tilting her head. Now she was like a statue, and she was looking at the primary docking viewport. I followed her gaze. The ship was already there. I don't know when it had arrived. There had been no approach alert, no identification ping, no standard docking request. It was simply there, hanging in the dark about 200 meters off the primary bay, and the first thing I thought, the very first thought, before training kicked in, before protocol, was that it was alive. I know that's not a rational thought. Ships aren't alive. But this one looked it, not in any mechanical way, in the way that certain shapes carry a sense of intent. It was long and narrow at the front, widening toward the rear in a way that reminded me of a deep-sea predator I'd seen once in a nature documentary, built for speed, built for endurance, built to move through its environment without resistance. The hull was dark, not matte dark but deep dark, the kind of dark that seems to consume light rather than simply not reflect it. Along the sides, running from the nose to about 2/3 of the length, were markings in a color I don't have a word for. Not red, not gold, something between the two that my brain kept trying to categorize and failing. I pulled up the identification database on my tablet. The ship wasn't in it. Not in our records, not classification unknown, just absent. The sensor array couldn't even get a mass reading. The ship was there, visible, physically real enough that 6 people in the docking bay were staring at it, and our entire sensor suite was reporting back what amounted to nothing. That was when my comm crackled. Sergeant Osai. It was Commander Yev Hayloren, the station's military liaison, and her voice had that very particular quality I'd heard once before, controlled, precise, and scared absolutely clean of any wobble. We need you at Primary Bay. Now. I was already moving. By the time I reached the command staging area beside the Primary Bay, there were 14 people I recognized, and about 6 I didn't. The ones I didn't recognize were wearing the kind of clothes that meant they'd been transferred up from somewhere fast and hadn't had time to change into station gear. 2 of them were humans. One was a Cathali diplomat I'd seen in briefings. She moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been in crisis situations before and had decided that measured movement was a survival strategy. And the last one was a Galactic Assembly observer, a Marenti named Counselor Fee, who had 8 eyes and was currently using at least 6 of them to stare at the viewport. Hayloren was in the center of it. She's one of those commanders who takes up more space than her physical size should allow, not tall, not particularly imposing in a traditional sense, but with a quality of absolute attention to the room that made everyone else orient toward her the way plants orient toward light. She saw me come in, gave a single nod, and said, "They sent a communication." Who sent? The ship. She turned back to the viewport. It broadcast on a frequency we haven't used officially in 6 years. Turned out to be a deliberate choice. They, whatever's on that ship, spent time learning our older protocols. They wanted us to know they'd done their research. What did they say? Hayloren was quiet for a moment. The viewport showed the ship still hovering, still utterly still, still doing that thing with the light that made it hard to look at directly for too long. They said they're here to meet the strongest defender Earth has. The room was quiet after that. Not the loaded kind of quiet. More the kind that happens when everyone in the room is processing the same information and hasn't finished yet. Counselor Fee spoke first, and her voice had a texture that translated devices struggled with, something layered, like 2 sounds occupying the same space. "You understand what that ship is," she said. It wasn't a question. Hayloren said, "Enlighten me." "That vessel belongs to Vorsheth." I didn't know the name. From the look on Hayloren's face, she did. The Cathali diplomat made a small sound that her species makes when faced with information that is simultaneously expected and terrible. "The Unbroken," she said softly. "They call him the Unbroken." I learned the rest in pieces over the next 40 minutes, in a briefing that had the quality of a conversation happening just slightly too fast to fully absorb. Vorsheth. In Galactic Assembly records, the ones accessible to a patrol sergeant with standard clearance, which admittedly isn't much, he was listed as a Category 6 combatant. The Assembly uses a scale from 1 to 5 for biological threat assessment. Category 6 is not officially on the scale. It's a designation that exists in the footnotes of footnotes, a number that got added to the bottom of the chart after an incident in the Heron Belt that the Assembly also, not coincidentally, officially classified as atmospheric interference. I looked at the chart later. Category 1 is minimal threat, standard containment protocols apply. Category 5 is extreme threat, immediate system-level response recommended. The description beside Category 6, in the dry language of Assembly bureaucrats, read as follows: designation applied in cases where subject has demonstrated the capacity to neutralize Category 5 responses without meaningful impediment. No established containment protocols. Consult Senior Strategic Command. In less bureaucratic terms, they'd run out of numbers. Vorsheth was a Rakath. If you don't know the species, they're bipedal, roughly humanoid in overall configuration, which is about where the similarity to anything familiar ends. They are, depending on how you count evolutionary years, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 years older than humanity as a spacefaring civilization. Their biology is, and I'm using the clinical term here, adaptive in ways that human scientists have been trying to understand for 2 decades and largely haven't. Put simply, Vorsheth had spent what appeared to be the better part of a century fighting. In that time, his body had adapted to survive things that should not be survivable. His musculature had reorganized itself around the stress of combat. His bone density was reportedly sufficient that the impact of his strikes had been measured, in documented engagements, at levels that destroyed reinforced structural materials on contact. He had fought 7 armies. He had walked through a planetary defense grid. He had, according to one account that was classified but which Counselor Fee related with the matter-of-fact tone of someone reciting historical fact, once been exposed to the core detonation of a Kethali battle cruiser at close range and been recovered from the debris field. Alive. The Assembly's policy regarding Vorsheth was, I gathered, roughly equivalent to a person's policy regarding a very large geological feature. Don't try to move it, work around it, and hope it doesn't decide to move toward you. He had been in something like retirement, or what passed for retirement in the life of the galaxy's most dangerous living thing, for 11 years. He'd been quiet, stationary, not bothering anyone. And then 2 weeks ago, his ship had started moving. And now it was here. And he had asked for Earth's strongest defender. The argument that followed lasted about 12 minutes, which felt short given what was being discussed. The essential shape of it was this. Some people wanted to send no one, to engage only through channels, to stall for time and contact Assembly leadership for guidance. This was, objectively, the safer bureaucratic position, the one that distributed responsibility and kept no single person in the path of whatever Vorsheth intended. Commander Haloran didn't take that position. He came here specifically, she said. He researched our protocols. He sent a message in a frequency we'd recognize. He's not here to attack. If he wanted to attack, there wouldn't be a conversation happening. He wants a meeting. We're going to have a meeting. With what representative? Someone asked. A colonel whose name I didn't know. Who exactly do we send to meet the Unbroken? Haloran looked around the room, quiet, steady, taking it in. Then she looked at me. I want to be very clear. I'm not a hero. I'm a patrol sergeant. At the time this happened, I was 34 years old. I had a daughter back on Earth named Amara who was 6. I had a bad left knee from a docking accident in 2058. And the most dramatic thing I'd done in my career up to that point was talk a Sauron freighter captain out of breaking a Cathali merchant's arm over a cargo manifest dispute. I was good at my job. I was experienced. I was not, by any metric I'm aware of, the strongest defender Earth had to offer. But Halloran looked at me and something passed between us that I still can't fully explain. It wasn't an order. It was more like a question. Can you do this? I didn't answer with words. I just held her gaze. She turned to the room. Sergeant Osei will go. They gave me 20 minutes to prepare, which mostly meant standing in a corridor with Tashel, who had followed me without being asked, and who was quiet in the way she got when she was worried. You don't have to go, she said eventually. I know. Nobody would say anything. I know that too. She was quiet again for a moment. Then, what are you going to do when you get in there? I thought about it. Genuinely thought about it, standing there under the flickering lights of Section D, with the distant sound of the station returning to something like normal operation around us, and the knowledge that 200 meters off the primary docking bay sat the most dangerous living thing in the known universe, waiting. I'm going to treat him like a person, I said. Tashel looked at me for a long moment. Then she did something she almost never did, which was put one of her large hands briefly on my shoulder. With her, that was equivalent to about 6 paragraphs of emotional support. Then she stepped back, and I walked toward the docking bay. The airlock pressurized with the sound it always made, that deep, mechanical thunk of equalization, and the inner door opened onto the connector tube, and I walked down it, and I tried not to think about how thin the material was between me and open space. The outer door of Vorsheth's ship opened before I reached it. Not dramatically, not with a hiss of atmospheric venting or a flood of colored light. It just opened, like someone who had seen you coming and reached out to let you in before you had to knock. A small gesture of intention. I know you're here, come in. I went in. The interior of the ship was not what I expected. I had been bracing myself, without consciously realizing it, for something that looked like a weapon. A space that communicated danger in its design. Dark angles, the aesthetic of violence. What I found instead was closer to a study. There were surfaces, not quite shelves, not quite walls, but somewhere between that held objects. Some of them I recognized as tools or instruments. Some I didn't recognize at all. There was something that might have been a book or multiple books bound together in material I couldn't identify. There was a light source that was soft and warm, the kind of light that doesn't cast hard shadows. The air smelled like something I couldn't name, organic, faintly mineral, not unpleasant. And in the center of the space, seated, was Vorsheth. I had been briefed on his appearance. The briefing did not prepare me. He was large. Not in the cartoonish way of things built for intimidation, not exaggerated, not designed. Large the way that certain old trees are large, with a quality of having become that size over a very long time rather than being built that size. His skin, his outer layer, I should say, because Rakath anatomy uses a word that doesn't translate cleanly as skin, was dark, with an undertone that shifted when the light caught it, moving between brown and something almost like deep blue. His face was structured differently from a human face. Wider jaw, eyes that were set further apart and were a solid deep amber, no iris visible in the usual sense. His hands, resting on his knees, were large and scarred in a way that spoke to a history I couldn't read but could feel. He was watching me. I stopped about 3 meters away, not because I calculated the distance, because it felt like the right distance. A conversation distance, not a submission distance, not a challenge distance, just room to speak. I said, I'm Sergeant Dara Osei, Earth Station Mirador, 14th Orbital Defense Corps. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes moved over me, not appraisingly, not in the way of an opponent taking measure, in the way of someone listening, except with more senses than just ears. Then he spoke, and his voice came through the translation device on my comm link in something that was close to a deep, unhurried baritone, and he said, "You are not afraid." It wasn't a compliment. It wasn't a provocation either. It was an observation offered with what felt like genuine curiosity. I considered lying, decided against it. "I'm afraid," I said. "I'm just not going to let that run things." Another silence, longer this time. And then Vorsheth did something unexpected. He tilted his head slightly. It was a small motion, but on his scale it read clearly, and something moved across his face that I hesitate to call a smile, because it wasn't quite that. But it was adjacent to one. It was the expression of a person who has been presented with something unfamiliar and found it interesting rather than threatening. "Sit," he said. I sat. What followed was, objectively, one of the strangest conversations I have ever had in my life. I'm going to try to tell it accurately, which is difficult, because some of what Vorsheth said doesn't translate cleanly, and some of what I understood in the moment is hard to reconstruct in language. He talked about his travels, not in the way someone would tell you about places they'd visited for pleasure, more the way a very old person will sometimes tell you about the shape of their life, and you realize partway through that they're not really talking to you, they're talking to something in themselves that needs to say the words out loud. He had been, before the retirement counselor Fee had mentioned, what the assembly called an arbitration force, a combatant deployed by mutual agreement of conflicting parties to resolve disputes through single combat or demonstration, rather than through full military engagement. A very old practice, one that had saved, by some estimates, millions of lives over decades by substituting one fight for many. He was good at it, the best apparently, the best there had ever been. He told me about some of the engagements. Not with pride, I want to be precise about that, because a lot of people I've told this story to imagine some kind of boasting warrior. He didn't speak with pride. He spoke with the careful, weary precision of a surgeon describing operations, the facts of it. What happened and what it cost. "Do you know," he said at one point, "how many species warriors I have faced?" I said I didn't. 43, he said. 43 species, their best, their champions, their trained killers, their ancient warriors, their chosen defenders. He paused. None of them could stop me. I didn't say anything. I was listening. 43 species, he said again, more quietly. And in the 11th year of my work, I realized that I had stopped learning. Every fight was the same underneath, different shapes, different weapons, but the same. He looked at his hands, at the scars on them, with an expression I can only describe as tired. A thing that does not learn is no longer alive in the way that matters. It is only continuing. "So you stopped," I said. "I stopped." He looked back up at me. "For 11 years, I waited to see if rest would teach me something, if I would find something I did not know how to do." He paused. It did not come. The room was very quiet. "Why Earth?" I asked. He took his time answering. I had the sense that he was deciding something, not about what to say, but about how much of the truth to give voice to. "Humans," he said finally, "are the only species in the assembly who have never sent a champion." I frowned. "We've fought. We've had soldiers in." "You fight," he said, "in armies, in teams. You coordinate, you adapt strategies, you change your minds mid-battle." A pause. "You do not have a tradition of the single defender. The one chosen to represent the whole." He looked at me steadily. "I have studied you. 43 species, everyone had such a tradition. Warriors who trained from birth to become the embodiment of their species' power. Humans do not." I thought about that, and that interested you. "It confused me," he said, with a precision that suggested the distinction mattered. "Confusion is rarer than interest. I came to understand it. Here is the part that I have thought about more than any other part of this story." Vorsheth asked me a question. He asked it carefully, with the kind of attention he gave everything, not casually, not rhetorically. He said, "What do you defend?" And I realized, sitting there across from the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, that this was actually the question. Not how do you fight, not how strong are you, not any of the things I'd been half bracing for. Just that. What do you defend? I thought about Amara. I thought about Mirador, the noise of it, the flickering lights, the smell of 40 different species cooking, Tashel's hand on my shoulder. I thought about the Sauron freighter captain I'd talked down from a violent mistake. I thought about the cargo handler in Bay 12 who'd come to me 3 years ago when her partner was sick, and she didn't know how to get emergency medical transfer, and I'd spent 4 hours on comms cutting through bureaucratic channels to make it happen. I said people, I defend people. And then, because it felt incomplete, not the idea of people, specific people, the people I can see. Vorsheth was very still. "That is not the answer of a warrior," he said. "No," I agreed, "I'm not a warrior." "Then what are you?" I had to think about that one. "Someone who showed up," I said, "and kept showing up." The silence that followed was different from the other silences, heavier somehow, with more weight in it. Vorsheth stood up. Slowly, not with effort, but with the kind of deliberateness that very large, very powerful things move with when they are being careful about the space they occupy. He was tall. Standing, he was a head and a half taller than me, and broader, and there was in his physical presence a quality that I can only describe as gravity, not metaphorical gravity. Or not only that, but an actual sense that the room organized itself around where he was standing. He looked down at me. 43 species, he said very quietly. Every champion I faced, they wanted to prove something, to their people, to themselves, to me. A pause. "You are not trying to prove anything." "I'm trying to understand what you need," I said. "That seems more useful right now." Something shifted in his face. Not the adjacent to a smile thing from before, something deeper. Something that took me a long time afterward to find a word for. The word I eventually landed on was recognition. Like he'd found something he'd been looking for without being sure it existed. He walked me through the rest of the ship. Not all of it, it was larger than it had appeared from outside, which shouldn't have surprised me but did. He showed me the navigation chamber, which contained charts of star systems I didn't recognize alongside ones I did, all overlaid and annotated in Rakath script. He showed me a space that served, as best I could understand, as a training area, but there were no weapons in it, or at least nothing I recognized as weapons. What it held was a collection of instruments of measurement, calibration tools for forces and stresses and impacts, a record of what he was capable of rather than what he'd wielded. He showed me one other thing. In a small chamber off the main corridor, small by his scale, so still quite sizable by mine, there was a wall, and on the wall were marks, hundreds of them, careful, precise in Rakath script, not crude scratches, deliberate notations. Records, he said, and his voice was different when he said it, quieter, stripped of even the small amount of performance that exists in speech. Every engagement, every opponent, what they were capable of, what I learned, a pause, what I took from them. I stood in front of that wall for a long time. "You kept track," I said. "Someone should," he said. It was such a simple thing to say. Someone should, quietly, without drama. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy had spent a century keeping careful records of the people he had defeated, because someone should. I don't know exactly what happened to me in that moment. Something eased. Some tension I hadn't consciously been holding since I'd walked through his airlock, maybe since I'd left Tashel in the corridor, let go. I turned around and looked at him directly. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. He considered the question for a long time. "I do not know," he said. "I came here because humans confused me. You still confuse me." Something moved in his eyes, not distress exactly, more like someone facing a horizon they can't see the end of. "That is new." "Is that good?" He looked at me. Directly, clearly. with all of that amber attention focused in a way that made it hard to be still under. "Yes," he said, "I believe it is." I walked back through the connector tube. The docking bay was exactly as I'd left it, except that there were now approximately 40 additional people in it: military personnel, assembly observers, a Cathali medical team that someone had apparently called in as a precaution, two people I didn't recognize who were almost certainly intelligence, and Tashel, who was standing exactly where I'd last seen her, and who met my eyes the moment I came through the inner airlock. I gave her a nod. She gave me a nod back. It covered everything that needed to be said. Halloran was at my side before I'd taken 10 steps. "Report," she said, quietly enough that it was between us. I told her everything. I tried to be as precise as possible because precision felt important. I told her about the room that looked like a study, about the records on the wall, about what he'd said about the 43 species and their champions, about the question he'd asked me and what I'd said. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's he going to do?" "He doesn't know yet," I said. She thought about that. "And you believe him?" "Yes," I said, "I believe him." She looked at the viewport. The dark ship was still there, still doing that thing with the light, still absolutely motionless. "The assembly is going to want a full debrief," she said. "I know. They're going to want to know if he's a threat." "He's not," I said. "That's not why he's here." "Then why?" "He was lonely," I said. Halloran looked at me. There was a long pause. "That's what you're going to put in the report." "That's the truest thing I know," I said. Vorsheth's ship stayed in position for 11 more hours. During those 11 hours I was in debrief. Multiple rounds, multiple questioners, the kind of intensive after-action process that strips out everything informal and human and tries to reduce what happened to data points. I gave them everything I had. I tried to stay precise. Every time someone asked me to characterize Vorsheth as a threat or a non-threat, I said the same thing. He's neither. He's a person trying to figure out what comes next. They didn't love that answer. At some point during the 4th debrief session, I'd lost track of time by then, was running on bad coffee and the very specific focused clarity that sets in when you've been awake too long. One of the intelligence people, a human woman with the kind of careful stillness that meant she was very good at her job, leaned forward and asked me, "Did you make any agreements with him? Any commitments on behalf of Earth or the Assembly?" "No," I said. "Did he make any requests, any demands?" "No," I said. "Then what did he want?" I put down my coffee. I thought about the wall covered in careful marks. I thought about 43 species and their champions. I thought about someone who had been so strong. For so long, that strength had stopped teaching him anything, and who had traveled to the one species that had never played his game, and sat across from a patrol sergeant with a bad knee, and asked a simple question. He wanted to talk to someone who wasn't afraid of him, I said. Not because they were stronger, just not afraid. The intelligence officer looked at me for a moment. "And was that enough?" she said. "I think so," I said. "I think that might have been everything." At 3:40 station time, during the 6th hour of my debrief, someone came into the room and handed Commander Halloran a note. She read it. Her expression didn't change. She had one of those faces that managed itself very well under observation. But something did change, very small and very quick in her eyes. She looked at me. "His ship has moved," she said. I understood what that meant before she said the second part. "He's gone," she said. "Gone." That's the word that's in the official report, buried under 14 layers of classification and bureaucratic language, in a document that officially describes the whole event as an unspecified sensor irregularity and atmospheric interference, and a temporary docking anomaly, and half a dozen other phrases that mean nothing. Gone. Vorsheth the Unbroken Category 6, the most dangerous thing in the known universe. He came to Earth Station Mirador. He sat in a room that looked like a study. He talked for a few hours with a patrol sergeant who showed up when asked, and then he left. No attack, no demands, no demonstration of the thing he was capable of. Nothing in the records to indicate he'd been here at all, except for the sensor data that the assembly quickly found reasons to reclassify, and the memories of the people who'd been in that docking bay, and the debrief sessions that went into files I'm not authorized to read. And me. I've thought a lot over the years about what he found here. What made him leave the way he left, not in triumph, not in disappointment, but in something that my gut tells me was closer to satisfaction. The quiet kind. The kind that isn't about getting what you wanted so much as finding out something was real. I think he'd spent a very long time in a world that responded to him in only one way. He was the strongest thing in any room he entered. He had been the strongest thing for so long that strength had become the only language anyone spoke with him. Challenge him or yield to him, those were the options. And when you're in a world with only one language, you stop learning. You stop growing. You become, in his word, only continuing. He came to humans because we hadn't learned that language. Because we don't have champions in that tradition. Because the person we sent to meet him, me, wasn't trying to beat him or impress him or even survive him, was just trying to understand what he needed. And what he needed was someone who would sit down and talk to him like he was a person. That's it. That's the whole story. The most dangerous thing in the galaxy needed someone to talk to, and we were the only species that talked back without trying to prove something. There are things I carry from that day that don't show up in any report. The wall of careful marks, the records of 43 species, kept by the one being who had the least tactical reason to keep them and the most human, the most real reason, because someone should. The way he said yes when I asked if confusion was good, simple, without performance. The moment, very brief, when I was standing in front of that wall of records and I turned around and he was watching me, and I had the sudden clear sense, not a thought exactly, more a physical knowledge, that he had never shown anyone that room before. I don't know where he is now. The assembly has sensors that can track Rikoth drive signatures across 3 sectors, and their records on Vorsheth's movements from the point he left Mirador are blank. He moved into dead space between the relay stations and the tracking simply stopped. He could be anywhere. He could be sitting in a room somewhere, adding a new mark to a wall. Or maybe he stopped needing to keep track. Maybe that was the thing he learned. My daughter is 13 now. She asked me the other night. She's been asking more questions about work lately, trying to understand what it is I actually do up there. She asked me what the scariest thing I'd ever seen was. I told her this story. All of it, the way I've told it here in the right order, trying not to leave anything out. When I finished, she was quiet for a minute, the way she gets when she's processing something. Then she said, "So he was really scary, but he wasn't mean." I thought about it. "Yes," I said, "that's exactly right." "And you weren't scared?" "I was scared," I said. "I was scared the whole time, but I was more curious than scared, and I figured if he'd wanted to hurt anyone, we'd already know." She thought about that for another minute. Then she said, with the kind of simple certainty that children sometimes have and adults mostly lose, "That was smart." I didn't tell her that it wasn't strategy. It wasn't bravery in any martial sense. It wasn't training or preparation or anything that would look impressive in a debrief. It was just being a person to another person. Showing up. Treating him like his questions mattered and his weariness was real and his curiosity was worth taking seriously. It's the same thing I do every shift on Mirador. Every dispute, every frightened cargo handler, every late-night call from someone who doesn't know how to navigate a system that's too big and too complex and too indifferent. Showing up, treating people like they're real. I don't know if Vorsheth is out there somewhere learning something new. I don't know if we gave him anything that lasts. I don't know if the most dangerous thing in the galaxy is at peace or still searching or something I don't have a word for. What I know is that he came here confused and left not confused. That something shifted in that room, in that conversation, in the space between a patrol sergeant with a bad knee and a warrior who'd run out of things to learn. Whatever that was, it happened. It was real. The lights still flicker in Section D. Tashel still moves like someone in constant small motion. Haloran still takes up more space than her size should allow. And I still walk the same corridors every shift, doing the same work, keeping track of the same small machinery of people living and working together in the dark above the world. Someone has to. End of account, Sergeant Dara Osai, 14th Orbital Defense Corps, Earth Station Mirador. Date of recording classified. Classification level restricted. Official status inadmissible, reclassified as anecdotal personal narrative. Note by recording officer. Subject maintained consistency across all 6 debrief sessions. No contradictions identified in account. Recommend standard non-disclosure protocol. Personal note added by Commander Yev Haloran, appended to sealed file. For the record, and this part won't go anywhere, but I want it said somewhere. What Sergeant Osai did in that bay was the most effective piece of first contact diplomacy I have ever witnessed. Not because of training, not because of tactics, because he walked in there and treated a Category 6 entity like a person who deserved a real conversation. I want that in writing somewhere, even if it's sealed. Some things should be on the record.